It's good to be back with you. I'm going to click on share screen so I can show you some images from the Nuremberg trials. There we go. Does that look all right, everybody? Give me a thumbs up.
Yep,
Good. Okay.
good.
Not as good as Armin's background, but it'll have to do. So, all right. So it's good to be back with you. I've had the pleasure of speaking before uh, this organization, this group, many times, and always enjoy seeing the familiar faces and names on the screen. So today is the Nuremberg trials. What without a doubt, the most important and consequential court trials in world history. And they would establish a number of precedents and a lot of what the world knows today in terms of war crimes, crimes against humanity, trying international dictators and other thuggish folks. It all comes from Nuremberg. So it was a very consequential series of trials. What I thought we'd do is we look at the background, look at why Nuremberg as a city, why it was picked, why did they go there, why was it so significant to go to that particular city, and then I'll go through all the nuts and bolts of the actual trials. There was more than one. There were a number of trials. So let's, without further ado, and there we go. All right, so just a quick historical context. You're looking at a young Hitler, of course, a corporal in World War I. So a lot of the rise of Hitler, the rise of the Nazis, all begins with the close of World War I, and that was the result of the Treaty of Versailles that ended the war. A lot of scholars, and I agree with them. Now, of course, the Germans after World War I should have been punished. They were the belligerent nation. They started it. They were the belligerents. But the way that the victors punished them really was problematic in the long term. Germany was hit by the victors with deindustrialization, demilitarization, war reparations, and so on. So Germany was really put on its knees after the war. The idea was so that Germany could never cause a problem like this again. The great irony here is that by putting Germany on its knees, it would allow for the rise of Hitler to come up and to blame Jews, to blame the victors in the war, to blame everybody but himself and the German people, to play the card of fear mongering, blame mongering, scapegoating. And it's extraordinary that Hitler even rose to power. Hitler was a social misfit. He was a failed businessman. He was a compulsive liar. He was a narcissist. He was just a strange bird, almost without any really close friends. He was a bully. So if you look at Hitler as a background, it's amazing that this guy would ever rise to power. But in the vacuum created after the war and all the ill will within Germany, it allowed him to blame everybody else and appeal to the vanity and pride of the German people. The US, one might say, was in some ways complicit. We were a part of the Treaty of Versailles. The British and the Americans raised the concerns that maybe the world's going a little too far in punishing Germany, but the French were insistent on it. After all, they had been overrun during the war. So that's really where you see the seeds of the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. Something that would factor directly into the Nuremberg trials and the choice of Nuremberg was these Nazi racialist theories. We all know what the term racism means. Racialism is different than racism. Racialism is when racism is institutional, it's systemic, it's throughout society. It's found in our laws, in our code, in our stories, in our culture. So think of, let's say, apartheid South Africa, where whites and blacks had different codes of law. Blacks were paid one amount, whites were paid another amount. Blacks had to live in a certain part of the city or country, whites in another part. Everybody was given an ID card, and if you're white, you could pretty much go anywhere with it. If you're black, you had a limited number of places you could go, and so on. Think of the American South before civil rights and clearly under slavery. where it was illegal in many cases for blacks to not only vote, but to read, to write, to own a gun, to own arms. Interracial relationships were banned. So when racism is on such a level that it becomes institutional, becomes systemic, that's racialism. That's what the Nazis were doing. So one way that Hitler appealed to everybody is he and Heinrich Himmler came up with all these fanciful views that the Aryans were lords on earth, that the Aryans were supreme. Who were the Aryans? These are the Germanics and the Scandinavians, the Norwegians, the Swedes. What Hitler and Heinrich Himmler saw as the perfect Ubermensch, the Superman, the Ubermensch, the blonde, blue-eyed, tall, muscular, square-jawed. In other words, people that look just like Hitler, right? Or Goebbels, or Himmler, or Goring, or hell, any of them. None of them look like what they talked about. So they came up with these ideas that the German people, that they told them that you are preordained, you're destined to be lords of the earth. You're a Superman. You're superior to everyone. They even broke it into two categories. You have the civilization builders, or the Aryans, and you have the master race and the civilization destroyers, which they also referred to as the mud races. So who are the Aryans and master race? Like I said, Scandinavian and German. Everybody else was considered mud race. That would be the rest of Europe, Asia, Asians, Pacific Islanders, folks in the Americas, Africans, the Middle East, Jews. Everybody else was considered a mud race. And what Hitler and Himmler told the German people was the only reason you're not already lords of the earth and supermen is because you've been interbreeding with mud races, which has weakened the bloodline. Remember that line that will come into effect very soon in Nuremberg. Hitler and Himmler said that there was once upon a time a great German civilization superior to ancient Rome, the ancient Athens, the Athenians, superior to the any other great civilization, the Chinese dynasties, the Egyptian great civilizations, the Mayan, the Incan, the Aztec, and so on. Here's the problem. Hitler wanted proof of this great Germanic civilization once upon a time, so they hired archaeologists to dig all around Germany to find the evidence that would be similar to ancient Athens or Rome. You know what they found? Bones and clubs and mud huts. The people living in present day Germany were basically living almost like cavemen back at once upon a time. So they couldn't find any evidence of a great German civilization. Did that stop them? No. They came up with a variety of theories. One was that the German people didn't originate in Germany. They came from, are you ready for this? The lost city of Atlantis. Yeah, and after Atlantis sunk in a day, thousands of years ago, the German people migrated from that sunken city to present-day Germany. So that's the kind of baloney they were up to in spewing all these racialist theories. They even went so far as to suggest that the only reason there is a great culture and civilization in ancient Egypt or in Rome or in Athens was that a group of Germans went there and built it. So a group of Germans built the pyramids. That's what they taught in their history classes in Nazi Germany. A group of Germans built the Colosseum and built all the roads to and from Rome. A group of Germans were overseeing the Acropolis and the Parthenon. This is what they were teaching in Nazi schools. It's madness, everybody. It's absolute madness. Here's how far they went. They said that there was a German carpenter named Joseph who went to the Middle East and met a teenage local girl named Mary, and they had a baby named Jesus who was German. That's what Hitler and Himmler ordered be taught in German schools in the 1930s. I guess his name was Jesus Helmut Gunther Schmidt. He was German. So this is how far they went with these racialist theories. And of course, this stuff is whack, and I'm laughing so I don't cry. But this would eventually turn into, of course, the final solution, right, everybody? Um, so Nuremberg. So in 1935, Hitler really takes perhaps his first bold step toward what we would know as the final solution in the Holocaust. And that was the Nuremberg race laws. In 1935, he decided to take all these crazy theories, racialism, not racism, racialism, that the Ubermensch, the Superman, the Aryans as lords of the earth, the master race and mud race, and they codified it. They put it in code, and that was the Nuremberg race laws of 1935, pronounced in the great medieval city of Nuremberg in Germany. So this is where they announced this, and it banned interracial marriage between an Aryan and a non-Aryan. It required that if you are a senior commander in the army, the Wehrmacht, the Navy, the Kriegsmarine, the Air Force, the Luftwaffe, or if you're in the SS or Gestapo, you had to prove that you were of pure Aryan blood. You could not have Southern European, African, Asian, or Jewish, quote unquote, blood. So the laws were for, as you can see on the screen, the protection, of their bloodlines in German honor. There was a Reich citizenship law that was part of the 1935 Nuremberg race laws, which pronounced that Jews and others could never be full citizens of Nazi Germany. Now, this was back in the United States in 1968, we passed the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law, which among many things, it addressed the question, could former slaves, could blacks be full citizens in the United States? The 14th Amendment said yes. So this is a similar kind of thing, only it flipped the script by saying everybody could not be citizens except 100% pure Aryans. So you can see Nuremberg is an important city in Germany. It's where Hitler makes all these crazy and rabid announcements. The Nuremberg rallies, you've all probably seen these photographs. In fact, everybody's probably heard of Triumph of the Will. Has anybody heard of that? Triumph of the Will? It was a film made by Leni Riefenstahl, a female actress in Germany, who Hitler plucked out of somewhat anonymity to make what was at the time the most expensive and seen as the greatest propaganda film. This footage that you're looking at is from Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will. It was a film that documented the massive Nazi Party rallies in what city? Nuremberg. Again, it was an important medieval city, fantastic architecture, but it was sort of like I guess you could say, the homeland for the Nazis, like Mecca would be for Muslims, or the Vatican for Catholics, you might say. So Nuremberg, I mean, the choreography and logistics behind these rallies were extraordinary. Look at these scenes, everybody. 100,000 people would be in these parade grounds. The soldiers lined up in goose-stepping perfection. The music on cue, the blood red banners hanging everywhere. I always wondered, I mean, it took a whole day for everybody to get in position. What did you do if you had to pee? Right? Oh my goodness, I guess everybody carried a cup or a bottle or something. But anyway, so the Nuremberg was the scene of what Hitler saw as the greatest and most important Nazi Party rallies. And if you look at the center of each of these images, you can see a white platform, and there is the massive podium behind it, where Hitler would stand behind the podium and at these rallies whip everybody up into a hateful frenzy and make all of his important announcements. So all that comes from Nuremberg. Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht was in November of 1938. Kristallnacht means the night of the broken glass. So what this was you can see a synagogue is set on fire. There were dozens of synagogues around Germany that were burned. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of homes owned by Jews, homes and businesses that were destroyed. They busted the windows out of all of them, thus the name, the Night of the Broken Glass. There were hundreds and hundreds of Jews that were arrested, and a lot of folks were killed as a result of this. Now, textbooks, this is one of the areas where textbooks pretty much get it wrong. Kristallnacht is depicted as kind of a spontaneous uprising. A bunch of German youth were out at beer halls drinking too much, and they started throwing the steins through the windows of Jewish businesses. That's the way it's depicted in textbooks. That is wrong. Kristallnacht was planned. It takes place on the anniversary of the infamous beer hall putsch, which is what initially brought Hitler and the Nazis to power. So it was on the anniversary. So all the Nazi faithful are already out drinking and fired up. Hitler planned all this. He, Goebbels, Himmler took to the airwaves and whipped everybody up into a frenzy around the country. There was an incident where a German diplomat in Paris named Ernst von Rath, R-A-T-H, was shot and killed by a mentally disturbed young Jewish kid named Greenspan. And it was just a random act of violence as a result of Greenspan's family being persecuted by the Nazis because they were Polish Jews. At any rate, so Hitler goes on and he blames this kid Greenspan for not just shooting a German diplomat, but he says the Nazis uncovered, that was simply the tip of the iceberg, that there was a continental-wide plot by Jews to kill Germans. So this is the kind of propaganda that they set over the airwaves. And on November 8th and 9th of 1938, when people were in the beer halls, and this was blared out in the beer halls, they were encouraged to take to the streets and attack and kill Jews. And that's precisely what they did. And of course, a lot of these announcements came from Nuremberg. Anschluss. This is also in 1938. There you see the Nazis marching into Austria on your left. On your right, that's the main square in Vienna with a massive Nazi rally. So Hitler, who was Austrian, Hitler claimed that Austria was once a part of the larger Germanic Empire in history. There was no larger German empire. They just made it all up. But it was taught in schools. So he said Austria properly belongs as a part of Nazi Germany. The Nazis lined up their formidable military in 1938 on Austria's border, and Austria folded. It caved without a shot being fired. Now, this is not to say the Austrian people were completely innocent here of this massive, in the threat of a massive German military invasion. There were a lot of Austrians, as you can see in the bottom. They were applauding. They were giving Heil Hitlers. Germany might say was welcomed into Austria. So this is the conquest of Austria, which starts the dominoes falling. And when almost all of Europe would come under Nazi reign, it starts here with Anschluss in Austria. Germany annexes Czechoslovakia around the same time. Hitler was keen to grab Czechoslovakia for two reasons. One, he claimed that Czechoslovakia was once a part of this larger Germanic empire that he imagined and conjured out of thin air and then lied to everybody about it. One of the things that all dictators do is they attack the past. They try to tell you that the past was different, and they don't allow an honest rendering of history to come out. And the second reason was Czechoslovakia is very, very natural resource rich. You put a shovel in the ground, you come up with precious ores. There's a lot of coal, hardwood. So Hitler wanted all that to feed the war machine to take over the continent. Then, of course, on September 1st, 1939, he would invade Poland and World War I began. The Kindertransport, this was planned in Nuremberg. The Kindertransport was in 38 and 39. It's when Jewish children were allowed, about 10,000, to leave Germany and make their way by boat or rail, many to Amsterdam, then from there to England. The British took in 10,000 Jewish children. This was all part of a Joseph Goebbels propaganda ploy to tell the world, you see, we're good people. But it was also to get rid of the Jews. Remember, this is before the final solution where people were put to death in crematoria and camps. So this is part of that. And of course, the planning is in Nuremberg. St. Louis, also the planning. This is the Voyage of the Damned, as it's called, 937 Jews in 1939, in May of 1939. So this is after Kristallnacht. This is after, and of course, Jews lost their homes, their businesses, their synagogues, their life savings in Kristallnacht. So people didn't have two pennies to rub together, you might say. So they 900 and some were able to board the ship and leave and go to Cuba. Once they were in Cuba, however, they were turned away by the authorities there. President Bru, B-R-U, and other authorities turned them away. Why? It was Joseph Goebbels, planned in part out of Nuremberg. Here's what they did. They allowed 900 and some Jews to leave. And they said to the world, you see, we're good folks. We're letting people sail and leave. But then they sent agents to Cuba who announced that the people on board the St. Louis were prisoners, were the diseased from disease hospitals, and were from mental institutions. So Cuba didn't want them, and it allowed the Germans to say to the world, you see, the Cubans didn't want them either. And then the ship sails around the Caribbean, and every country turns them away. The United States turned them away, not once, but twice, even Canada. The only country that didn't was the Dominican Republic, but the message didn't get to the ship in time. So it allowed the Germans to say to the world, you see, we were the good guys, but the whole world, no one wants Jews. So it was all part of the propaganda. It again ties into Nuremberg. The Wannsee Conference, if you've heard of this was in January of 1942. That's Reinhard Heydrich on the left. Hitler called him his blonde beast. He was known as the Butcher of Prague. Czechoslovakia was so important that Hitler put his favorite general, this guy, Reinhard Heydrich, in charge of Prague to make sure the production of all those ores continued. Hitler put Heydrich in charge of the Wannsee Conference. This is a suburb of Berlin, just outside of Berlin. You're looking at the building where it was held. This is where the Nazis planned the final solution. The early planning was in Nuremberg, but the actual the architecture of it was in Wannsee. This is where they decided they would eliminate, genocide an entire group of people, Jews. They also went after gays, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others. So here is just a list to give you some sense. This is a map of Europe. Every one of those black marks is where there's a concentration camp. Every one of the red skull and bones is where there's a death camp. So you can see this one from Italy to France to Eastern Europe to the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. It was continental wide, everybody. Norway, Denmark. So all these are marks of where there were concentration camps and death camps. In the red, that's Nazi territory. As you can see, at one point in the war, the Nazis had taken over all of Europe with the exception of Switzerland and Sweden and the Iberian Peninsula, which is Spain and Portugal, which were neutral. Although Spain and Portugal, Franco, the fascist dictator in Spain, and Salazar, the fascist dictator in Portugal, were actually kind of helping Hitler. Hitler helped both of them come to power, actually, by providing weaponry for their brutal civil war so that they could win. So you really have Switzerland and Sweden as neutral, and then Great Britain's trying to fight back. So an alarming situation. Okay, so then why the Nuremberg trials? So these trials occur, the war ends in 1945. In Europe, the war ends in May of 1945. In the Pacific Theater, after Truman dropped not one but two bombs on Japan, it ends in August of 1945. So May and August of 45. At the end of the war, there's a question, what do we do? I want to just emphasize the chaos. Look at the city on the right. Much of Europe looks like that city on the right. Europe had been blown to pieces by air raids and bombing on all sides. So what you find is most cities are destroyed. Um, the sewage systems in cities are destroyed, which means you have open, raw, festering sewage. You don't have indoor plumbing. The water and electrical systems were destroyed. So you have cities without power, without running water. The fields, the farm fields across the continent were fallow during the war. Nobody was planting and growing on them, which means you're facing the prospect of global starvation. There's no way to get medicine, foods, anything into Europe because the ships were sunk, the ports were blown up, the train tracks were destroyed, the trains were destroyed, the roads and bridges and trucks were blown up. I mean, so you're looking at an existential crisis. Harry Truman thought this was going to be a biblical pandemic as disease and death and starvation pours across the continent. This is one of the reasons why he pushed the Marshall Plan and early versions of the Marshall Plan to save all of Europe. So the question is, what do we do? Here's a big concern by Truman and others. Roosevelt, that without running water, without sewage systems, without electricity, without food, with Europe on its knees, it will succumb to communism. They realized that Stalin was a problem early on, that Stalin and the communists and the Soviet Union, Russians, were willing to disrupt everything and try to spread communism. If you're starving, if there's no running water, et cetera, no healthcare, you're more likely to be prone to the enticement of communism or anarchy. So they knew they needed to get things done right away. They knew this needed to start with what? A trial, to try the Nazis. And what city should it be in? There's only one, Nuremberg. Not only was Nuremberg important for the Nazis, it was their Mecca, but it was one of the few cities in Germany that wasn't utterly and completely destroyed. So here's some just numbers on the Shoah, the Holocaust, to give you a sense of and these are probably conservative numbers, just to give you a sense of the number of people and groups that were killed by the Nazis during the war. Globally, the estimates are 60 to 80 million people dead because of World War II. 60 to 80 million people dead. I'm going to skip this for now. Okay, well, let me just say that, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union created Trizonia, the 3 districts, which were combined then to Bizonia, the East and the West, which would become West and East Germany, the Berlin Wall and all that. So those 3 powers, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, are trying to figure out, how do we have a trial, what would become the Nuremberg trials? Where, how, what? So Nuremberg was the obvious choice, and their Hall of Justice was still standing. It wasn't blown up. Stalin's plan, no surprise here, is bloody as hell. Stalin wants to just execute up to 100,000 Nazi officers. In other words, there would be no men left in Germany, just wholesale execution. He wanted complete demilitarization of the West. That way he could go in and seize everything and take everything over. He wanted to create 2 German states. The Allies could have 1 state, that would be West Germany. He would then seize the other state, which would be East Germany. And he wanted no conditions whatsoever for rights or freedoms. So what a monstrous person. So obviously that was unacceptable to the French, the British, and us, the Americans. Churchill never trusted Stalin, rightfully so. Churchill gets that one right. He saw Uncle Joe, as he and Truman called him, as a problem early on. Churchill even contemplated invading the Soviet Union because he knew we'd be fighting them sooner or later, which proved to be true with the Cold War. He saw the Russians as quote unquote outwitted bunglers. He said they're a bunch of fools and they're bloody and they're barbaric. They're like cavemen. So how do we have a fair trial if we put the Russians in charge? We cannot. The Americans and British have to step up here. Churchill also wanted to just wholesale execute Nazi officers without trial. The Americans said no. It was Truman that said, absolutely no, we're not going to just wholesale slaughter people, even if they're the Nazis. We can't win the war and then lose the peace. Moreover, as Truman said, the eyes of history are upon us. The end doesn't always justify the means. It's how we conduct ourselves. We need to prove that constitutional systems, that jury by your peers, trials, freedoms, and rights prevailed during this global war. So you have a couple of American plans. I'll just show you two. This is Henry Morgenthau. He was FDR's Treasury Secretary. He outlined, he issued a memo on how we should have these trials. He wanted most Nazi leaders just shot on sight. That's not acceptable. Military trials for second-ranked officers. So now, if we're going to kill all the top Nazi leaders, but we're going to have trials for all the colonels, majors, captains, and lieutenants, we're going to have 500 trials, and this is going to last a decade. He wanted to demilitarize the country and force Germany to have no military and to just have small agricultural plots. Herbert Hoover, who worked with Truman in opposing the Morgenthau Plan, said tens of thousands of Germans are going, if not millions, we're going to die of starvation if we do that. Truman said we cannot have an unstable Germany. An unstable Germany is what happened after World War I, right, everybody? Which made possible, as I said at the beginning of the speech, the rise of Hitler. If we destabilize Germany again with war reparations, deindustrialization, demilitarization, Truman said we're going to fight him again in another 20 years. You know what? He was right. We need to forgive, but never forget. There's a difference, everybody. Forgive, but don't forget. So Truman said we needed a trial that will produce the rightful punishments for the Nazis, but also justice in the eyes of history in the world, but will produce a stable Germany. Thus, they relied on Stimson. Henry Stimson was the Secretary of State. He called for judicial proceedings. He wanted a more moderate approach. He said we should not leaders on trial, absolutely, but only the top ones and in a dignified manner so that we win the peace, not just win the war. It should be an international tribunal. Now we're going to have to invite the Soviets to sit in, but the Americans, the French, and the British will essentially run it. Here's another important thing that Truman liked. Not only are the eyes of history upon us, the eyes of the world, and we've got to prove that this thing is done in a humane and just way. But look at the bottom bullet point. Stimson said, and Truman agreed, we need a record of the Nazi atrocities. So we need an open trial with judges, prosecutors, defense. It needs to be recorded. It needs to be open. People need to be able to listen to it. And we're going to then document this for history so that people won't deny there was a Holocaust. Like the people at Charlottesville, Virginia that marched, that the January 6th people, the Proud Boys, QAnon, all these groups deny that there even was a Holocaust. The lessons of history. So Truman comes in after FDR dies on April 12, 1945, and it's Truman that takes the Stimson plan and begins the Nuremberg trials. Truman had a meeting called the London Charter, where they established all the protocols and principles for the trials, which follow our own Constitution and our own legal system. No one's above justice. It established the International Military Tribunal System, and Truman appointed Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson to be the presiding judge there. And Truman gets everything right, everybody. An International Military Tribunal. So there was the Nuremberg trials, which was the first main trial of, just about 24 senior Nazis, but there were a total of 13 trials. After Nuremberg, where they tried the top Nazis, there would be another 12 tribunals. So Nuremberg was in 45 into 46. The subsequent Nuremberg military tribunals would be 46 through 49. In total, over 200 defendants were tried. It was by jury with prosecutors, judges, and defense. The four allies, the Soviets, the British, French, and Americans, each appointed a judge and a backup judge in case if something happened to the judge, because they wouldn't have to start it all over. And each one appointed a chief prosecutor. The defendants, the Nazis, were entitled to 2 attorneys. They even allowed them to have German attorneys if they wanted. They provided simultaneous translation. That was a new system developed by IBM. The first time the world ever used simultaneous translation was at the Nuremberg trials. And we even paid for it. So the defense, that the Nazis could have defense, and they were paid for, just to make sure we were erring on the side of justice. There were controversies. There were legal challenges. Can we try them after the war for crimes that did not exist before the war? So this is ex post facto. Crimes against humanity did not exist before Nuremberg. It was brought up at Nuremberg. You can see in the middle of the page, I wrote ex post facto. The Nazis called it victor's justice. If you win, you get to impose justice, which all of history did that. And of course, anything but justice, but we actually were trying to do it the right way. There was no real precedent for this. There was the Turkish genocide in Armenia, and Captain Henry Wirtz, he was the Confederate warden at Andersonville Prison that killed over 13,000 Union soldiers in a year. In fact, I'm driving there tomorrow to give a speech. It's National Prisoner of War Day on Friday. We wanted, could we have such a thing as an international tribunal? Would a country's legal system be subjugated by an international tribunal? That was a concern. What about the perception that everybody's found guilty? How do you have a fair trial if everybody's found guilty? So one of the concerns of Truman is, even though they're senior Nazis, we really can't find everybody guilty, or this won't carry weight in the eyes of history. Harlan Stone, the famous justice, called it sanctimonious fraud and a high-grade lynching party. He was on the wrong side of history. The other justice, William O. Douglas, said the Allies substituted power for principle. Those two were on the wrong side of history. We did it according to the principles of justice. So why Nuremberg? I told you that earlier. On the right, you can see the city of Nuremberg, and you can see the Palace of Justice. On the left, this is the courtroom from the Palace of Justice. The picture image on the right is from the time period. You can see that it wasn't destroyed, plus it's in Nuremberg, plus it's the Palace of Justice. There really was no other place to have a trial. This is Justice Jackson, picked to be the presiding judge, one of the great American jurists. Here's the kicker, everybody. He never graduated from law school. I sometimes think that some of the current Supreme Court justices never went to law school when I read some of their opinions. But in 1934, he served as a lawyer, as a general counsel for the IRS. You can see he was a U.S. attorney, U.S. Attorney General, the Solicitor General. The Solicitor General is the attorney that brings the lawsuits on behalf of the government before the Supreme Court. He was on the U.S. Supreme Court and so on. So eminently qualified and a hell of a jurist, even though he never went to law school. I don't think we'll ever have anybody on the court again that didn't go to law school, even if some people act like they didn't. So there were 4 charges, 4 indictments at Nuremberg. Here they are. Count 1, they called it the common plan. It was for conspiracy. Conspiracy to commit crimes, conspiracy to murder people, conspiracy to. This is if you're part of the Nazi party. Count 2 was crimes against peace. Crimes against peace. Count 3 would be war crimes. And 4, the worst, was crimes against humanity. That, of course, would be genocide and the Holocaust. Today, we've codified all these. You hear about these. If it was, let's say, the Serbian butcher Slobodan Milosevic, or Vladimir Putin should be facing these, and within some period of time, all these crimes, these are now internationally recognized. Here's a definition of each of the 4 for you. So conspiracy would be participation in a conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, so forth and so on, being a part of the Nazi party. Crimes against peace would be waging an aggressive war, a violation of treaties. There are norms for how to commit a war, how to prosecute a war. If you're at war, you should not target civilians. You should try to minimize casualties. You should rebuild the area that was destroyed. Try to hit only military targets, not civilian targets. Soldiers should only have to give their name, rank, and serial number, and prisoners should be treated accordingly. So crimes against peace. Of course, the Nazis didn't adhere to any of that. 3, war crimes. Violation of the customs of war. The Nazis targeted civilians, targeted ethnic groups, etc. wanton destruction of cities. Um, Crimes against humanity, number 4. This would be the extermination of entire populations based on race and religion, i.e. the Holocaust. The verdicts handed down. So what came out of the Nuremberg trials? 12 of the initial group of just about 24 were sentenced to death. They were hanged in the courthouse gymnasium area, which is outside. You can see the area here. There were no appeals given. This is the one area of our legal code that they did not follow. Fair trial, judge, jury, everything else, but no appeals. 10 were executed, and the sentence of death was carried out. They wanted a firing squad, the Nazis did, because the gentlemanly way to put an officer to death, a military officer's firing squad. But Truman and others said, no, we're going to hang you. That's the non-gentlemanly way to do it. Hermann Goring, the Luftwaffe Air Force commander and number 2 Nazi, he committed suicide right before he was sentenced to be killed. He had a cyanide capsule, and we don't know how he got it. It remains a mystery. One theory is some of the Russian soldiers handed it to him. 7 were sentenced to prison terms in Spandau prison. 3 did life terms. The other 4 were given 10 to 20 years. Karl Dönitz, who was the head of the Kriegsmarine, that's the Navy, he was only given 10 years, the shortest term. Why? Because after Hitler committed suicide, Joseph Goebbels committed suicide, Goring committed suicide, Himmler committed suicide. They were all caught and committed suicide. The top-ranking Nazi was Karl Dönitz, and the admiral, and he surrendered in May of 1945. So because he surrendered, he was only given 10 years. Was he apologetic? Absolutely not. He wrote a book about the glorious 12 years that Hitler was in power and claimed the Nazis were right. 3 were acquitted. Of course, the ones that everybody wanted to see on trial were Hitler, Goebbels, and Himmler. Other leaders like Robert Ley, he was the one that built a lot of the big public projects. They all committed suicide or were killed, so they were never brought to trial. Here's a list of those who were executed. You recognize a lot of the names there. And in parentheses, I put their position within the Nazi party. So you can see these are the leaders. They are the top people. What about Reinhard Heydrich, Hitler's favorite general, the blonde beast, who came up at the Wannsee conference with drafted the final solution? He was the highest ranking Nazi to be killed during the war, to be murdered. He was assassinated by a group of resistance fighters outside of Prague in 1942. So he got his comeuppance. This was the hangman. You can see him there on the lower right with the noose, Master Sergeant John Woods. He became somewhat famous initially as being the hangman of Nuremberg, and he volunteered and wanted the job. It became a big scandal afterwards because we found out he was a fraud. He's the one who hanged and cremated the Nazis. He also earlier worked in Dachau. The ashes of those that were hanged, appropriately enough, talk about poetic justice. After they were hanged, they cremated them in Dachau in the same ovens they used to kill thousands of Jews. Then they threw their remains in the Isar River. So Woods was the one who oversaw all that. It turned out, however, that he actually had gone AWOL from the Navy and had been court-martialed, but he assumes a fake identity and tells everybody he worked as a jailer and as a hangman. He was diagnosed as mentally unfit. He had multiple mental psychoses, including psychopathic inferiority complex. So he was crazy. He even bragged that he hanged 10 men in 103 minutes. He said, that's fast work. So he was a piece of work. So after Nuremberg, there were 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials from 46 to 49. These 12 trials were different categories. For example, one category, all the physicians were tried. Then all the industrialists in Germany were tried. then professors, then journalists. Then so they tried them by category. In total, 185 defendants. Defendants of them in the 12 subsequent trials, 24 were sentenced to death. 11 had their sentence reduced to life in prison. 128 were imprisoned, many for life. 25 were found not guilty. And there's an image of the subsequent trials there on the right. Here I broke down all the categories so you can see them. The medical case, that's all the doctors and so on and so forth. So these are the 12 categories of people tried, the 200 and some defendants after Nuremberg. So what's the legacy of the Nuremberg trials? Many, multiple. Number one, it thoroughly documented the Holocaust. You got senior Nazis to admit that they're the ones that started World War II and they're the ones behind the Holocaust, and that the Holocaust was real. Two, it demonstrated the rule of law. As Truman said, we can't win the war and lose the peace. We can't just, as Churchill and as Stalin and others wanted, we can't just wholesale slaughter everybody. We have to have the rule of law and offer everybody a trial. It helped to win the peace. Germany and Japan, and there were similar trials over in Japan, Germany and Japan have been among America's closest allies ever since World War II. They're reliable votes in the UN, they're trading partners, they're stable, peaceful democracies. It worked. It became a model for the Tokyo tribunals that were held concurrent with the Nuremberg subsequent tribunals. Tojo, the psychotic dictator, was put to death. Truman did not want to see Hirohito put to death, wisely, because you'd make him a martyr. Remember, he was seen as a god on earth. So by co-opting him, and then Hirohito told everybody to lay down their arms, Hirohito. So it helped to end it. The Nuremberg trial inspired the creation of the United Nations Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which remains in effect. The United Nations Genocide Convention against forms of genocide. Sadly, we've had instances like Rwanda and elsewhere since then. The Geneva Convention, which provides standards for what is a just war and how to conduct oneself during war. And I mentioned a couple of those principles earlier. It also lays out how you should treat prisoners. It was also the precedent when Israel captured Adolf Eichmann in Argentina. And then they brought him to trial. There were war crime tribunals done for dictators in Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and elsewhere around the world. And Nuremberg was the template for all of that. I just want to end with something kind of bizarre. I'm speaking to you today from Lynn University, which is a little private college in Boca Raton, Florida, little sleepy campus, one might say. Ironically enough, this is a picture from our archives on campus. We have what's called the Blue Series. Guess what we have at Lynn? Justice Jackson. We have all the documents from the Nuremberg trials. It's here at Lynn. I suppose it should be in Yad Vashem in Israel, or the Holocaust Museum, or the US National Archives, or the Library of Congress, or the Smithsonian, but it's here at Lynn. At one point, I'm going to approach the administration at Lynn about making sure that we at some point send all this and give this series to the National Archives and let them decide where it belongs. It's 42 volumes. It was Justice Jackson's private collection. It's the official record of the military tribunals at Nuremberg. It includes the procedures, all the witness testimony, the verdicts, the sentencing, everything. How the hell did we get it? Unbelievably, Justice Jackson gave them to a friend of his named Marilyn Shorenstein. And like everybody, Marilyn retired to Boca Raton, Florida. So that's a rule. If you're not in Boca, everybody, all of you with My Health Angel are eventually going to have to come to Boca. It's a rule. You have to retire in Boca. After she retired in Boca, she joined a group called Lay, which is a Jewish social organization. And she gave them the books. They had no idea what to do with them. Some of the members of Lay used to come to lectures here at Lynn. So they gave them to Lynn. And Lynn said, my goodness. So Lynn put them in the archives, and we take great care of them. But this should be someplace else. So that's the story of the Nuremberg trials, everybody. Thank you for your attention.
Wow. That was amazing, as always. There's a couple of questions chatted in here. I see Esther asked if the invasion of all the other countries by Germany unprovoked, much like Ukraine's invasions today.
Yeah, Hitler invaded Europe. Again, he annexed without a shot Czechoslovakia and Austria. Although while he said they did it peacefully, he had the threat of a complete invasion and annihilation. Then, of course, Poland, September 139. And then he would hit the lowland countries, Belgium, Luxembourg, and so forth. He hit Scandinavia, France, Southern Europe. So he did it for a number of reasons. One reason was what he called Lebensraum or Lebensraum, which means elbow room, breathing room. He had this crazy idea that there was once a great German empire, and he wanted to reclaim it. But the whole continent of Europe was never part of Germany. There never was a German empire. But he wanted breathing room so the German people, the German idea could grow and grow and grow. Putin invaded Crimea, the Crimean Peninsula. He invaded eastern Ukraine and seized parts of Belarus. Now he's been trying to invade all of Ukraine because he wants breathing room. Number one, Ukraine sits between NATO European countries and Russia. So it's a buffer, the same way Hitler saw a buffer between them. Number two, the Ukraine is natural resource rich, just like Czechoslovakia was, right? Number three, Putin wants to bring back the Soviet Union. He says the worst moment of the 20th century is when the Soviet Union collapsed. That was one of the best moments. The worst moment would have to be World War II, of course. So for all those reasons, Putin invaded the Ukraine. It was unprovoked. It was a peaceful neighbor. In fact, it had been an ally. The same way, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria were all peaceful neighbors and allies. So yeah, there's some great parallels there. I agree. And I hope that Putin gets his comeuppance the way Hitler and all the senior Nazis did. If Putin's not assassinated by a disgruntled general, Russian general, who's afraid of facing his own war tribunal, which they all will face, or if he's not assassinated by someone whose kid died in the Ukraine for nothing, or if he's not assassinated by the oligarchs who stole billions of dollars and now all that money's gone because it's been seized, it's been frozen, it's been confiscated. None of those oligarchs can go get on their yacht in the Mediterranean and see their mistress because they can't get out of the country and the yachts have been seized. If one of them he gets his comeuppance. If he doesn't get all that, and if he lives through this thing, at some point he'll be brought up for war crimes and crimes against humanity. So.
Interesting. Okay. Okay. And then I see Armand ask, did Churchill go along with the U.S. running all of this?
Good, Armand. Good question. So the short answer is yes. The long answer is a wee bit more complicated. The British people, in an almost unforgivable act, after the war, they get rid of Churchill as prime minister. Thanks for saving Britain. Thanks for saving Western civilization. And he's the only one really standing up. Remember, the United States did not get into World War II until after Pearl Harbor. So 39, 40, and much of 41, Britain standing almost alone because the French are rolled. The Italians joined with the Nazis. The Soviets are on the defensive, getting annihilated. Operation Barbarossa. So Churchill's replaced. But yes, Armand, Churchill had his concerns, but Churchill went along with what FDR and Stimson recommended. And then when Truman comes in, Churchill goes along with all that. So even when he's out of power, he becomes an advocate from the sidelines for what the vision of what we know as Harry Truman. So yeah, I'm happy to say he went along with that. And I think Churchill saw the error in his proposal to just line up and mass shoot senior Nazis. So yeah, he went on. Good question.
Okay. And then there was a question that came in from Suzanne. If Germany thought Asians were mud people, why did they consider Japan an ally?
Good question. Hitler and uh, Heinrich Himmler absolutely ordered that schools teach that there's a mud race and a master race. And Orientals, that's the term they used in the 1930s, we would say Asian, were definitely listed as a mud race. So why did Germany align with Italy and Japan? Remember, Italy, as Southern Europeans were considered a mud race, but it was an alliance of convenience. So Hitler had that alliance as convenience. He divided the world into two spheres. Japan has its Pacific sphere of influence, so they can gobble up much of the Pacific, which they did. The rape of Nanking, where they killed at least 200,000 Chinese, beheaded them, burned babies, threw children up in the air and caught them on the end of a sword, all sorts of crimes. They could have the Pacific. Hitler would then take the Middle East and Europe. So it was a marriage of convenience. He knew that the United States would end up having to fight a war on two fronts. We'd have to fight Germany and Europe, but we'd also be fighting Japan. So that would relieve pressure of having the full weight and force of the American military might on just Germany. Same with Mussolini. Mussolini was a fascist, but Hitler saw Mussolini as a buffoon. And of course, saw the Italians as mud races, even though Rome was a great empire, perhaps unequaled, even though what Hitler adopted as the eagle, as the symbol of the Nazis, he borrowed the eagle design from the Romans. The blood red banners, you know, the big banners they marched with and were all over Germany, they borrowed the Roman design of the banners. He even borrowed, you know, this Heil Hitler crap from Romans doing this and saluting. He borrowed so much from Rome, even though he considered them to be a mud race. But remember, when you're talking Hitler, you're not talking rational. He was irrational. He was whacked. Out of his, again, here's a little dark-haired, swarthy, weak guy talking about the Ubermensch, or these tall, muscular, blonde, blue-eyed, square-jawed lords on earth. He looks nothing like it. Hitler rose to the rank in World War I of what? Corporal. It was, with all due respect, don't misconstrue, but he was a lowly corporal. Joseph Goebbels never fought in World War I. Joseph Goebbels ordered that the physically handicapped and mentally handicapped be put to death. Thousands of folks with mental illness, mental retardation, and handicaps were put to death. Guess what? Joseph Goebbels was handicapped. He had a clubbed foot. He kept it a secret. So, you know, these guys were just, you know, grotesquely hypocritical. Heinrich Himmler didn't fight in World War I. One of the few that did was Goring. Goring was an ace. He was a combat pilot that had a certified record number of kills, and that's how you get the ace distinction. So yeah, we got to remember that the hypocrisy is just off the chart. And of course, the German people came from the lost city of Atlantis. There was no lost city of Atlantis. And at one point, what they were saying in the textbooks in Germany in the 30s is the city of Atlantis sunk 9,000 years ago. And it was so great, it was so technologically advanced. Everybody, 9,000 years ago, we were working on two inventions, the wheel and fire. There was no technologically advanced civilization. When they were trying to find out where the lost city of Atlantis was, the Germans, they had an archaeologist, his name was Ernst Schaefer. He was an impressive anthropologist and archaeologist. He actually looked like Harrison Ford, you know, the Raiders of the Lost Ark. They were looking for biblical artifacts before the Nazis caught him. So they were trying to find the lost city of Atlantis. One theory was it was in the Bahamas, thus the resort Atlantis, right? So maybe there it is. They were looking at the Pillars of Hercules, which is, you know, by Gibraltar. They were looking at north of the British Isles. So one of those little fairy isles off the northern coast of Scotland. I mean, just madness. They had another theory, and this, you know, I wrote and filmed a TV show for the Science Channel, and it's now running in Europe on Fuse and the Super Channel. on this. I filmed the show. So I did insane amounts of research to do it. But when I first read it, I thought, there's no way anybody's going to believe this baloney. The other theory, besides that the German people didn't come from Germany, they came from the lost city of Atlantis. The other theory was called the world ice theory. Armand, are you ready for this one, my man? Okay, you ready for this, Linda? Here it is. There were two moons. One was an ice moon that they wrecked, and the one moon, they ran into each other. One moon came down and landed in the North Pole, and the Germans were on that ice moon. That's where they came from. And that was literally a theory that Heinrich Himmler and Hitler were. Now, here's where it gets crazier. As best as we can tell, Himmler actually believed this stuff. Hitler, I don't think, believed any of it. He was just using it to try to dupe people. He was just, that way. Heinrich Himmler used to say that he was descended from King Arthur. He was a direct descendant from King Arthur. By the way, King Arthur's a myth. I'm a direct descendant from Zeus. I don't know if you knew that or not. So crazy stuff.
So there was Suzanne also added, there seems to be a lack of evidence that Hitler really committed suicide and that he actually escaped. Any thoughts on that? Was he ever found, his body or anything, or that was just never?
Okay, yeah, he committed suicide. So we're not 100% sure, but we're 99.99% sure. So the Nazis did have something, they called it the werewolf trace. Here's what it was. Get the hell out of Germany. Don't rats abandon a sinking ship. So what you saw is that people across Europe, let's say Portuguese who disagreed with Salazar, or Spanish who disagreed with Franco, Italians who disagreed with Mussolini, Germans who disagreed with Hitler, they ran for their lives. A lot of them went to Lisboa, Portugal, and then they would get on ships and go to South America, Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, and so on. From there, they went into the hinterlands of those countries all the way to Paraguay. The head of the Paraguayan government in the 60s was Adolf Stroessner, who was a Nazi. Then they had those helmets with the horn on, the spike on top from the Kaiser. But anyway, so there was a way in which people that tried, they called Lisbon, Portugal, the escape valve of Europe. Now, when the Nazi kingdom, the reign, when it was collapsing, a lot of senior Nazis fled too. They knew they were going to die, so they got the hell out. And didn't they catch Eichmann and others in Argentina and elsewhere? Yeah, they went to South America. So the theory would be that Hitler escaped. He was in his bunker in Berlin, and there was no way out. The Russians, the British, and the Americans, 360, had Berlin surrounded, and Berlin was being reduced to rubble. As they worked their way into Germany, we have communications from Hitler from the bunker. You have eyewitnesses of Hitler inside the bunker until the very last moment. So there's no way he could have gotten out. Some say, oh, he boarded an airplane he kept and they flew out. There was no way to get to an airstrip, and every plane was shot out of the sky. We had complete air superiority. Hitler took a cyanide capsule, then shot himself in the head, then had his body burned in the Reichsgarten. So the trifecta, the hat trick. Same with he had his dog killed, Blondie, his German Shepherd. His brand new wife, he married her in the bunker, Eva Braun. She also took a cyanide pill, committed suicide, had her body burned. Joseph Goebbels and his wife. Goebbels killed his 6 children in the bunker. So there was just mass suicides. There was a secretary named Trudel Young who lived through this, a young secretary, and she said she stood there and watched them burn Hitler's body. So there were eyewitnesses. The problem that leads to this, sort of 1% that believe that he didn't, is that the first people to get to the bunker were not the Americans, British, or Canadians. It was the Red Army. It was the Soviets. And of course, like everything, they steal everything and don't release anything. Here's what I would say. All the evidence points to Hitler dying in the bunker. Did some Nazis manage to get to South America and were found in Brazil and Argentina and Paraguay? Yeah. There's no evidence whatsoever that Hitler did. And your world's leading historians don't even give this the time of the day. So I would go back and say I'm, 99.99% sure that he did, but we're not 100%. Anything else?
Nicole, you're on mute.
Sorry, Esther added about something regarding the higher up officials having a replacement tooth implanted cyanide that they could crush down to commit suicide. I don't know if that's
Yes,
something.
they're right. That's right. So a lot of the high level Nazis, I'm tying my shoe. I apologize. I just realized both my shoes were untied. Talk about Zoom etiquette. So yeah, what they did is they had a tooth removed, typically a molar in the back, and they had a fake cap that looked like this put over it that had room to put a pill, a cyanide capsule inside of it. This is what Heinrich Himmler did. He was the head of the SS. Heinrich Himmler, my other computer is going to click off. Let me do that so I don't lose you. Heinrich Himmler was the head of the SS. He went on the run. He ran around, I guess it was around the 28th of April-ish. He went on the run. He changed his identity. He gave himself a new identity as a German police officer. So he wasn't in the military, he said. And he gets caught by the British, who are going to turn him over to the Russians. And he commits suicide. He takes out the fake tooth, and in there's a cyanide capsule. He bit into it. This could have been what Hermann Goring did when he died in the Spandau prison. However, there's a record that they checked Goring for a fake tooth because so many other Nazis, and they didn't find it. Does that mean it wasn't there? I don't know. But yeah, a lot of them did that and bit down on it to commit suicide, which means they, even though they were whacked and fanatical and lacked any sense of humanity or empathy, that shows that they knew that what they were doing was wrong and they didn't want to face the tomb. They knew they would be put to death, but it would have been, for history, three of the worst people ever to walk this planet were Hitler, Himmler, and Goebbels. It would have been important, I think, to have them on the stand to face the consequences and give, not that it provides closure, but to give an ounce of it, and also to hear their side. Not that you want to give people like this a mouthpiece, but nonetheless, there you go.
Yeah, sure. So John had a question. His father-in-law, who never spoke of his wartime army service, was a guard at Nuremberg trials.
Whoa.
Is there some way of confirming this, and how would he go about doing that?
I'm guessing, John, your father's no longer with us.
This is my wife's father, my father-in-law, and yeah, he's about 10 years. He has passed.
So here's what you can do, John. Contact your member of Congress and tell them that you would like to run a check on your father-in-law and his military service. This is a service that Congress and the Pentagon provide free of charge. I've had it done several times for individuals that are going to be in some of my books and research. I've also encouraged dozens of people in my career to go do the same thing. So if you contact your member of Congress, tell them that, give them the name, where he was from, what year he was born, if you know the unit. In other words, provide a list of as much information as you can. Your member of Congress, you can request it. They will put an aide who provides constituent services. The aide will gather all that information and take it to the Pentagon. The Pentagon has extensive records on everyone. You'll find out every battle he was in, every city he was stationed in, every fort he was at, where he did his basic training, and where he was and what he did inside Nuremberg. He was a guard. He was assigned to this day, that month. There were 13 trials. You'll find out which one he was assigned to. They have all that information. It's declassified. It's all available. So definitely pursue that. Who's your John, do you live down here in South Florida?
No, I'm in New York. I'm on Long Island.
I was going to make an introduction to Congresswoman Lois Frankel or Congressman Ted Deutsch's staff. They're my two members of Congress, and they're both friends of mine. and their staff has looked this kind of stuff up for me in the past. So good luck with that. And that will be interesting to find out all that information on Nuremberg. And that picture I showed you, your father-in-law would have been there. That was the Palace of Justice. I showed you the aerial shot and the interior shot of where.
Yeah,
he
the
was.
white helmets, I think,
Yep.
right?
You
Yeah.
got it.
Yeah.
You got it.
It'd be great to do that because he was a person who, he never talked about it, you know.
Yeah, John, I have met so many people that were in the war or so many Holocaust survivors. I used to videotape Holocaust survivor stories and World War II vets stories and then send them to museums as a professional service, I guess you could say, for history. But I met so many Holocaust survivors and so many World War II vets who simply never talked about it. They just didn't talk about it. So one way to look at this, I always say, with the Holocaust, you have, you have thousands of people that tape their stories, but there's at least 6 million stories that will never be taped. With World War II, we're losing that greatest generation of veterans, and many men didn't talk about it. My 3 sides of my family, of the 4 grandparents, my paternal grandfather and my maternal side were Scottish, as you could probably guess from my last name, Watson. But my paternal grandmother would never talk about anything her whole life. And I asked her, to the point of being an irritating kid, I wanted stories all the time. She would never tell me where they were from, what they did, nothing. And several years ago, I keynoted the International Genealogical Association conference. I'm not a genealogist, but they asked me to talk about how to use government archives and old documents, and that's what I do for a living. And afterwards, to thank me, the board of the International Jewish Genealogical Division, they said they would run my family tree for me. They took the DNA swabs, all the information, and this is the board of directors of the international, and what they found out was my paternal grandmother was Jewish, and we never knew, and she never said anything because her family had apparently survived the pogrom in Germany, and I guess it was so harrowing with everybody being killed, she never talked about it. I don't like to tell my own 2 kids used to ask me about my life, and I played football in college. I played basketball. I was lucky enough to have an athletic scholarship. I can't really tell from Zoom, but I'm a rather big guy. But I didn't tell my kids about plays that I screwed up. I still remember a trying to tip the basket in at the buzzer and it didn't go in. I remember missing a tackle. I don't even like to share details of that, yet alone something as harrowing as losing your entire family in the most gruesome way. I often tell my students on campus about why veterans don't talk about their stories and why Holocaust survivors don't. I say, imagine the worst thing that's ever happened to you, multiply it by 100 and tell it to a stranger. Of course, you're not going to talk about it. So yeah, dig that up, John, and you might find some new tidbits in there about your father-in-law's service. And it would be great to know where he was stationed, all of his units, what they did, any citations he won, they'll have all that information.
Thank you.
Just be persistent.
Will do.
Nicole, you're on mute again.
Sorry. There was a question here on Esther, from Esther. How is it that Adolf Eichmann was allowed to be tried in Israel and not in Nuremberg?
Good. So the German government was consulted by the Israeli government. And the German government gave the tip of the hat and allowed Israel to proceed. Now, I'm not sure the German government had standing to bring him back to Germany. He used to be a German citizen, so, I don't know. But that was under the Nazi Reich. So that's legal, terra incognita. But Israel did consult with the German government, who gave Israel the right to do it. And what's interesting is the trial was based on the Nuremberg trials, and all the protocols that were laid out in the subsequent agreements in the United Nations and elsewhere. So yeah, they followed that. It was the Mossad, Israeli intelligence, who tracked down Eichmann and went over and in a middle of the night snatch and grab operation, grabbed his butt and brought him back to Israel to stand trial. And Eichmann was unapologetic. He was a monster to the very, very end. So there was that snatch and grab thing. The United States did snatch and grab operations at the end of the war as well, although I've always favored them. It was Truman that authorized them. There were Nazi scientists who were on the cutting edge and developing atomic weaponry, developing, as we all know, the Nazi tanks, the Panzer, the Leopard, the Tiger, were vastly superior to our Sherman tank. A lot of the planes and fighters, the Fokker, all that of the Luftwaffe, had more powerful engines, and they were even working on jet engines. Nazi artillery. So a lot of the German scientists and engineers were beyond where we were. Truman realized that one of two things would happen. At the end of the war, the Russians, the Soviets, were going to grab all those scientists, which means the Soviets would have developed the atomic bomb, which means the Soviets would have gotten to the moon, which means the Soviet space program and missile program would have beaten ours, and that would have changed history, everybody. Or if the Soviets didn't grab them, and if the Third Reich became the Fourth Reich and the Nazis came back. So we wanted those scientists. So it was called Operation Paperclip, if I remember. Truman authorized that in the middle of the night, some of our people went in and just grabbed these scientists, and they woke up in the United States in a lab, and proceeded to develop missiles, rockets, and put us on the moon. Develop the atomic bomb, ironically enough. So so I supported that, and I support Israel doing the snatch and grab. And Eichmann's not the only former Nazi Israel has grabbed like that. They've grabbed others, and I think it's right that they did it.
An interesting question came in from Rosemary regarding Albert Speer, the Nazi regime's architect, went to prison and then wrote a book about his experience. Are you familiar with it, and how would you evaluate what he had to say about the Nazi government and his role in it?
Good. So Albert Speer was very close to Hitler. He was his personal architect. Hitler was, let's say, infatuated with Paris. Hitler wanted to rebuild Paris under the Nazis. He was going to build what he called his Führer city. It was going to be in Linz, Linz, Austria, which is near where Hitler grew up, which is right on the bank of the Danube River. In June, I led 2 history tours up and down the Danube and in 10 countries in Europe. And I took people to Linz and told them about this. I actually helped write and film another TV episode on the Führer Museum. So Hitler was fascinated by Paris. He thought it was, the world's most cultured city. Of course, the Louvre has some of the greatest art pieces, and Hitler was an artist. The architecture in Paris is extraordinary. So he wanted to steal and loot the art, find inspiration for the design. And so when Hitler went to Paris to study it, who did he take with him? Albert Speer. That's how high up Speer was and how important he was to Hitler. Speer, it's correct, he did prison time and he wrote a book. Historians agree that you can't trust any of the Nazi books written by former Nazis, but Speer seems to be one of the most accurate, reliable, put those in finger quotes, of the books. Speer seems to have looked at it reasonably objectively and at some points told the truth, whereas like Admiral Dunitz just said that the Nazis were right and they should have won. So yeah, Speer's book, I haven't read the whole thing. I read bits and pieces of it in English translation because I don't sprechen Sie Deutsch. But I'd recommend taking a look at some of those things, but they are awfully difficult to get through, knowing what Speer did.